So Ludum Dare 44 just got wrapped up and the review process has now started. If you don't know, Ludum Dare is a huge game development competition where you get 48 hours to create a game from scratch using only art and code you make yourself. The theme for this jam was Your Life is Currency, and I actually thought that this theme was really hard. For me, it kind of suggested two routes. The very literal interpretation, which means that you will have to create a game featuring currency and some kind of purchasing system, which is not the easiest thing in the world to make, or a more thematic interpretation which quickly gets very #deep. Now, normally I start with a brainstorm session to get the ideas flowing, but for some reason this time I instantly had a feeling that I wanted to create kind of a roguelike dungeon crawl game. And once I heard the theme, I immediately knew what the game should be about. But before we get into that, this video is sponsored by Jason Wyman. He's the creator of the amazing Unity 3D Masterclass, which takes you all the way from the very fundamentals of game dev to using Unity on a professional level. It will teach you the principles of solid code architecture and how to build a variety of game types. On top of that, you will also get familiar with packages like Cinemachine, Timeline, and Pro Builder. What makes this course unique is that you get to work along with other students and get live one-on-one help from Jason himself. He also has an amazing VR course that will teach you how to work with VR and even make a game. At the end, you will have made multiple finished games and have the opportunity to customize and show off your unique work to the class. Sign up now and the first 50 people will get a free shirt from Line of Code of your choosing, as well as a big discount and other bonuses on both courses. Simply click the link in the description and get started. So the basic idea is this. You play as a greedy wizard who has made a pact with the god of death to grant you power in exchange for your service. You can sacrifice your life in order to gain more power, but you have to be careful. Every time you die, you lose a fragment of your soul. Die too many times and your soul will get stretched too thin to be recovered. I thought this would work great with the theme because you are literally buying power in exchange for your life. So with that idea in mind, I jumped right into Unity and started, as always, with player movement. I quickly got a hexagon moving around the screen and pointing towards the mouse, but I later realized that I didn't want the character to be controlled with the mouse, so I instead made him rotate towards the direction of travel. Next up was some basic enemy AI. For this I used a very simple script that would slowly rotate and move the enemies towards the player once he was inside the search range. This ended up working fine, but it also meant I had to be careful with the levels I created, since the enemies aren't using pathfinding and will easily get stuck running into obstacles. Actually, I was surprised to learn that the Unity navigation system doesn't support 2D colliders yet. That's definitely something I'd like to see in the future. I then added the logic for sword fighting, however there were no animations yet to show what was happening, so I decided to jump straight to graphics. I took some time drawing out a nice base room to act as a backdrop, which looked alright, but I wasn't completely satisfied with it. So I tried just slapping on a hue adjustment layer and completely changing the color of the ground. I think that definitely made it look more interesting and evil looking. I then created some nicer looking doors that I could simply slap on top and some sprites for the player character. I decided not to give him arms and simply have the sword float in the air. This way I didn't have to create 4 different attack animations and I think it kinda worked. Yay! I also later added a trail renderer to the sword to help make the attack animation pop. Finally, I slapped on some post-processing effects to help tie everything together, as well as some lens distortion and noise to make the levels look less flat. Now for day 2, I added some blood particles that spawn when you kill enemies, as well as some animations for when enemies or the player gets hit by an attack. I then went on to create the death screen. This is where you can use your sacrifice to increase your power. At this point the UI didn't do anything, but I later ended up adding the option between increasing your agility, strength, or resilience. I would have loved to include more options here, like the ability to cast spells, purchase keys that unlock doors, and so on. But because of the time limit, I had to be careful not to take on too much. This is always difficult with game jams, and this time I actually kind of failed at that. At the end of day 1, I was feeling really discouraged. All the stuff I wanted to do ended up taking much longer than expected, and I had trouble seeing the whole picture or how I would manage to get the game to a playable state. Luckily, a good night's sleep helped a lot and I ended up having a really productive second day, but it's important to remember that game jams are about having fun. And it's just much easier to have fun if you don't overburden yourself and stick to something simple. Now, feeling refreshed this second day, I added pentagrams that act like checkpoints throughout the game. However, you have to be careful about using them since they require you to sacrifice your life in order to activate them, which means you will lose a soul fragment. I think this idea of hurting your character to save your progress was really fun to play around with. Now, one of the big challenges of this game was the moving between rooms. For this I had to come up with a good loading system that also made it easy for me to add more rooms in the editor and connect them together using doors. I tried out a bunch of different systems but ended up with this. So basically each room is a game object that gets activated when it is entered. Each door has a reference to the room object that it leads to. This way progress in each room is saved since all the objects simply get disabled and not destroyed when leaving a room. However, when the player dies, I want all the rooms to reset, but things like the player, game manager, and so on to remain the same. To do this, I put all the rooms in a separate room scene and loaded that onto a base scene with the player in it. This way, when I wanted to reset the rooms, I could simply reload the rooms scene. Of course, there are some limitations to this, and it isn't great for performance if you have a huge amount of rooms, but for the scope of this project, it worked perfectly. I then added soul fragments that can be picked up to help you progress further and created some sprites for the enemies. They kind of ended up looking like dwarf zombies in turtlenecks, but nevertheless I was proud of them. Next up I made some rocks and gravestones I could scatter around to give the room some variation. I added a game over screen and finally I created some enemy variations. Of course I had to create a larger enemy that moved slower but did more damage and had more health. I also made a ranged enemy that would shoot out fireballs, which I ended up reusing to make the head of the enemy itself. I also created tiny zombies that would quickly sprint towards you, and at this point I had enough assets to start creating a bunch of interesting rooms. So I did. I played around with combining different enemy types of varying difficulty. I placed pentagrams and soul fragments in different corridors. I created dead ends that would punish you if you walked into them, and finally it was time for the big boss. Except at this point I had spent so much time creating all these rooms that I pretty much didn't have time to create an interesting boss fight. So instead I pulled an Indiana Jones and made the boss seem really big and scary, only for the player to realize that he can be killed in one hit. No problem. And that was pretty much it. After getting my lovely wife Sophia to play through it all, I realized that she could just run through the rooms without fighting the enemies, so I made the doors locked until you kill all enemies in the room. I've said this many times, but game testing is important. Always get someone else to try your game. And with that, it was time to export. I created a quick icon and submitted it to the jam around 2 AM. I was tired, but happy, and mostly just surprised that I managed to finish in time. And that's pretty much it for this video. If you enjoyed it, make sure to subscribe and check out some of the other behind the scenes videos I've done for previous game jams. On that, thanks for watching and I will see you in the next video. Also, special thank... Hey, do you want to do it? Yeah, you should do it.
Alright. Thanks to all of the Patreon supporters who donated in April. And a special thanks to Infinity PBR, Cyborg Mommy, Dennis Sullivan, Chris, Shane Cleveland, Faisal Marify, Lincoln Chung, Leo Lisette, Runen, Daniel Dusanik, Konstantinas Karentas, Naoki Iwasaki, Gregory Pierce, Rob Fern, Dr. Poonmoon, Erasmus, Kirill Svidisky, Tim Avholtabak, and Tyson Konofsky. You guys... No, you know what? I can't. I'm not authorized for that. You have to do that.
You guys rock.